Roseland.
Roseland.
That's a nice course. Only ever played there once. Kingston. Oh, it's.
Yeah, no problem if you have to leave at 11:30. You'll get most of the content. You just might miss the session, the question and answer period. Well, it is 10:30 now, so why don't we get rolling since everybody seems anxious to get into this content. So we're happy that you guys have joined us. Welcome to our session on ergonomic considerations in warehousing and distribution. We'll do a proper introduction in a second with myself and my colleague Josh. But first, just want to give you guys some orientation to Microsoft Teams platform here in case you have been living under a rock the last 3 years and have never used MS Teams, or maybe you use another platform, but we'll just give you a quick orientation here. So first off, obviously using your computer audio today, it is best kind of taken in today using a headset like I have myself. Remove distractions, that sort of thing. We do have your mics muted for the session. For whatever reason, if your mic comes off mute, which it should not, but if it does, just keep an eye on that and we'll ask you just to mute it. We have a lot of people participating today, and so we have to kind of keep that background noise down. So to make sure that everybody can kind of take it in. As you are already getting accustomed to, feel free to use that chat throughout if you have questions. We'll try to answer those as they come. We might miss it or we might not be able to get to those questions until the end. But we'll, like most webinars, we'll have a question and answer session at the end there. So we'll get to that and try to answer all your questions. And usually what we try to do as well is if we can't answer all the questions in this session today, then we'll try to answer ones that got missed in a follow-up email. So use that chat. That's for questions. That's for comments. You want to let us know, how great our content is, how great of presenters we are, or maybe the jokes that we kind of launch are really landing well. Just let us know through that chat, or any kind of comments, questions, that sort of thing. Full screen mode is an option, and if there might be some slides that you want to see a little bit bigger. So really, like any other window in any other program, you just maximize it by clicking that expand button through the ellipsis. If you look at the bottom, you'll see an ellipsis there where you can select that option to enter full screen, and it will go to full screen, and you just do the same to reverse that. So it might be some slides there to expand and collapse, depending on the content itself. We are definitely going to be using some polls to get you guys interacting, get your kind of feedback on things. So they will be launching in two ways, likely in front of the slide for the poll that we launch. It'll come on the screen and you can select your correct response, input your response there and submit it. If for whatever reason you close that one out that pops on the screen, you can also answer it in the chat because that poll is going to come in the chat as well. So two ways to kind of handle those polls. If you are not seeing the chat, you can certainly click on that button there that looks like the chat, and it will open up that chat box if you're not seeing it currently. Alrighty, I think that's enough housekeeping and orientation. I think everybody's getting the hang of this already, so that's great. Just a quick intro for myself. I am Nathan Birch. I'm a specialized consultant in ergonomics with WSPS, and I've been with the company for about 4 years and in the ergonomics realm for about 15 plus years. So I've been doing it for a while in varying capacities and serving clients of all shapes and sizes, from the agriculture sector to the service sector, warehousing, distribution, manufacturing, all sorts of shapes and sizes there. So lots of different experiences there that I'm bringing today. And yeah, so hopefully we can bring a good session to you today. And I'm going to pass it over to Josh to introduce himself, and he will launch us into the content.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Josh. I'm a health and safety consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services as well. I've been with the organization now for almost 2 years. Okay, so prior to joining WSPS, I was working in the automotive manufacturing sector, and where I spent about 7 years in various roles. Before we get going, I just want to remind everyone, you will see a note at the top of the slide here. It does say that this session is being recorded. That's just for us so that After the session, there will be an email being sent out at one point saying that the recording is ready and that you'll be able to rewatch. Okay. Now, another common question that we do get as presenters of these safety connections is, can we share the content? Unfortunately, because of the copyright, we will not be sending out physical copies of the slide deck. However, we will be sending out a follow-up email with some resources and some key areas to kind of take back from today's session. Okay. So with that, we'll get into the content. So just as a reminder, what these safety connections really are is it's an opportunity for us to connect with our industry peers. Okay. So what we really want to do is review high level safety topics that are going on in the workplace and really have an open-ended discussion about areas for you to look at. Um, in navigating these hazards. Okay, so it is really a facilitation of exchanging of best practices within a variety of sectors, whether we're coming from manufacturing, agriculture, service sectors, what have you. And kind of the goal is to really give you a little bit of information so that you can go back to your workplace to review and possibly look at these hazards and see how we can optimize or further improve the workplace. Okay. So with that, our agenda for today's session is focused on ergonomic considerations in the warehouse distribution. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on and review key areas within the warehouse distribution area that poses, I should say, MSD hazards to workers. Okay, we also review some general guidance for you to consider and when reviewing these areas. We will also be discussing some common challenges, considerations that are unique for warehouse distribution. This may be things such as lift truck operations, manual material handling, the impact of racking installation, and our overall design of our workplace. Okay. And then at the end of the presentation, we will review some resources. So off the hop here, effective warehouse and distribution is often a topic that, regardless of sector, whether we're coming from the manufacturing, agriculture, service sector, is something that we're all trying to strive towards, right? Because effective warehousing distribution management ensures that there's a significant amount of stock available to meet our customers' order, fulfillment, and contributes to the company's supply chain. Okay, often this can help us streamline, reducing costs, and maximizing our efficiencies. Okay, so in many ways, and regardless of sector, this area, our warehouse distribution area, can almost act as a heartbeat, right? Because when we think about it, if we can't get product either in and out the door to help, serve our customers' requirements, or even when you think about things such as maybe in the service sector, some of our warehouse distributions are a part of where our patrons are walking in and out of our facilities. So it is important that we do have product available, right? So when we think about it, it can be such a very, very, very important area, but with that comes a lot of risks and hazards associated with the activities going on within this department. Okay, so despite there being many hazards, okay, this safety connection is really going to focus on the ergonomic considerations to help streamline and improve the overall risk factors that we will be discussing. Okay, so with that, just getting into some introductory MSD and ergonomic background information. So what is an MSD? Okay. Our bodies are made up of muscles, tendons, nerves, joints, okay, spinal discs, and other tissues. This is what we refer to as the musculoskeletal system. An injury to this system is what we would define as a musculoskeletal disorder. Now, there's a question at the top there. It says, what other names are used for MSDs? You might have heard things such as repetitive strain injuries, cumulative trauma disorder, musculoskeletal injury, work-related musculoskeletal disorders, occupational overuse syndrome. These are all interchangeable, okay? However, one thing that we do like to remind individuals of is just that MSDs do not include musculoskeletal injuries and disorders that are a direct result of a fall struck by or against, caught in or on a vehicle collision and violence. Okay, so we're really focused on the musculoskeletal disorder in terms of injuries to our muscles, tendons, nerves, joints, discs, what have you. Okay. So with that, just a little bit of additional introductory information is when we look at causes of MSDs, it can be a very complex result. But typically speaking, there's 3 primary MSD risk factors. Okay, excessive force, awkward postures, and repetition. And whether it's alone or working together, these cause or can cause tissues in our bodies to be overloaded, thus resulting in an MSD injury. So as we're going through today's safety connection, we're really focused on how can we improve these risk factors within the different functional areas or the different functional tasks within your warehouse distribution area. Okay. So really when we're getting into the recommendations, we're looking at, can we change the force? Or is there ways that we can better design our situations or our workplace to help promote neutral postures? Or is there other avenues we can do to help minimize repetition? And really working, through each of the functional areas to kind of review that. Okay. So we're going to start with a poll. Okay. Is poll number 1, what is the leading type of incident or the leading type of incident resulting in a WSIB and or lost time injury in your workplace? Now, with these polls, please select an answer and submit. You will have to close the poll on your end after you've submit, just so that one thing that feedback that we get from participants is that the poll's not going away. We need to close the poll after we've selected our options. So we got 44 responses already, and a large bulk of them, about 70% coming in right now, is sprains and strains. So I'll give it a couple more moments here. Awesome. Okay, so it ended up being 51 responses of the 73, so roughly 69% was sprains and strains. The second type was slip, trips, and falls, which is very consistent with what we see across all sectors, across all industries. Okay. Can I have a second poll here? So what is the top musculoskeletal disorder hazard within your warehouse distribution area? Okay, so further expanding on that, what's the top musculoskeletal disorder within your work area? We're just pulling up the poll. Give me 1 second.
Should be there, Josh.
Perfect. It didn't pop up on my end. Second. I've just lost the chat, that's all. It's loading. Can you see the results, Nathan?
I can. Yep. You've got 40% lifting and lowering materials. Next highest would be high repetitive work. And then that's 31% and 15% push pull, 12% awkward postures. Those are the main ones. So highest definite lifting and lowering.
Okay, for some reason it's not pulling up on my end. So we will close it there. So we're saying lifting and lowering was our number 1, right? Which is very, 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 very consistent with what we would typically notice across any area of the workplace that we're doing a lot of manual material handling. Okay, so that's a good indication for us to kind of make sure that as presenters and as we're going through the safety connection, we will talk about some of those factors that do impact the risk to workers in terms of lifting and lowering. We'll also get into different ways, whether it's through workplace design, whether it's through some additional controls, how we can minimize the other factors that are listed here on the slide. Okay, so moving forward, so as we like to talk about, is ergonomics is the solution. Okay, so it's the science of matching the work and the work environment to the person. So when we think about it, right, and this includes for our warehouse distribution areas as well, when we have good workplace design and we're got that human-centered design approach, we can really, really help promote, 1, a positive safety culture, but 2, increase our human performance, right? So a lot of times when we think about ergonomics or safety for that matter, we're really thinking about the MSD prevention and not always thinking about how ergonomic improvements can help drive human performance, right? When we talk about human performance, what we're talking about here is maximizing the human's ability to complete job tasks, whether that's from a productivity standpoint, efficiency, quality, safety, psychosocial factors. Okay, so a good example of this when we're thinking about warehouse distribution is think about a scenario where maybe we are getting product out the door where maybe we got to load a skid from the floor versus loading in and around elbow height, right? Think about from that simple scenario how productivity may be different, right? Now it's taking me longer to obviously lift from the floor. I'm getting into more abnormal awkward postures. Okay, from an efficiency standpoint, our humans would be quicker to be lifting in and around elbow height versus getting into these abnormal postures. Think about how these factors may increase our or impact, sorry, our quality, right? In terms of when we think about when things become more difficult, now our stimuli or our brains are really focused on multiple elements at that point where maybe quality might not be something or maybe something that gets missed, the overall safety or the risk for the worker, and then finally psychosocial factors, right? So, and the one of the more important reasons too that we really focus on this is regardless of industry and why this continuously comes up is that when we look at WSIB costs and workers' compensation costs across the province of Ontario, musculoskeletal disorders continuously is the number one um, cost when it comes to workers' compensation, making up in and around 40%. Now, COVID did kind of inflate some of these numbers. Okay, however, we are seeing based on the 2021 year that MSDs are coming back up as the number one again. Okay. So, in terms of the psychosocial factors, kind of piggybacking off that last point, we have another safety connection that we actually are reviewing this. I believe it's running again tomorrow, linking the psychological or psychosocial factors with ergonomics. And this is one slide that if you are attending tomorrow, you will also see again tomorrow. Nonetheless, though, we think about that scenario with the box on the floor versus in and around elbow height. Okay. A poor match between the work demands and the help the worker needs to meet those demands can produce an outcome that the worker's experiences stresses, okay, and induces responses to contribute to poor mental health, psychological, and physical health. Okay. From there, the stress reaction may also contribute to the development of musculoskeletal disorders. Now, at the bottom of the slide here, you see we have it split into behavioral response and psychological response. Okay. So behavioral response, starting on the left-hand side, is um, behavioral response to psychosocial factors are responses taken by a person that they are unaware of or that they perceive may help them cope with stresses placed upon them. Okay. Unfortunately, in many cases, these responses can increase the risk of developing an MSD, but it causes them to increase their physical and physiological exposure to MSD risk factors. So, some things that you might see from a behavioral standpoint, right? Whether it's frustration, right? When we get frustrated, maybe it's applying excessive forces. Maybe we start rushing, taking shortcuts. Okay. Maybe the individual starts taking medication to help with MSD pain, right? And many times when we start having those earlier stages of MSD symptoms, it's very common for us to start taking medications to help with that pain. Also, a very common item is decreased sensitivity to pain. Maybe we just view it as it being the norm, right? Or skipping breaks due to the job demands, whether it's maybe there's psychological pressures in the workplace to ensure that we're getting product out the door or products to the line or products to the next process, where that may drive us to have that additional behavior response where we're putting the work before ourselves. Okay. Now, in terms of the psychological changes and the psychological responses, what these are that people psychological changes that people experience due to stress that are intended to prepare a person to the physical resolution of dangerous problems or challenges in a short-term range. Now, what we see here is when the challenge has been resolved, the stress response typically shuts down. Okay. Now, similar to this, when the challenge has not been resolved, these psychological challenges are sustained and the body remains in stress mode. So when we think about psychological and psychosocial factors in the workplaces. In many cases, the stress caused by these factors, they're not necessarily issues that can just be managed and resolved by a one-time response. Okay, so why this is so important is in these cases where when there is workplace psychological factors, it could cause the body to be almost stuck in that stress mode. Okay, so some of the psychological responses we see when we're stressed: increased blood pressure, we tense up, right? Increases blood pressure, body remains at a heightened state of sensitivity. Now, directly attributing workplace psychosocial factors as a cause to workplace musculoskeletal disorders is difficult because there's a number of factors, whether it's biomechanical, rest, you know, age, sex, what have you. These are all factors that can play a factor in developing a musculoskeletal disorder. However, there is a general agreement that workplace factors, especially when it comes to psychosocial factors, can contribute significantly to risk to workers. Okay, so when we think about our warehouse distribution areas in the workplace, it's empirical that we take the time, take a step back and ensuring that we are setting it up in a way that is conducive to our workers, right? Because at the end of the day, when we think about these areas in our workplace, they're very manual. They can be very manually intensive, right? So when you think about a worker too, right? And you think about maybe there's different opportunities across your workplace in terms of different job functions and what have you, take a step back here and think about from a holistic approach. Would you want to work in that area, or is it something that your workers would feel comfortable working in that area? And when we start to understand, looking through the lens of our coworkers or maybe the different individuals that would be exposed to these hazards or exposed to that type and nature of work, that if we can take a holistic approach, design around them, it will help aid in things such as turnover. It'll make sure that our workers feel safe at work and that they are that we're helping foster an environment that allows them to be efficient and productive in that role. Okay. Couple notes before we get into kind of the bulk of the presentation is just from a high level, the legislation side. Okay. So in terms of musculoskeletal disorders and where it represents in the legislation, really under the act itself that applies to all industries, we're really focused on that general duty clause. Okay, the employer's general duty to do everything reasonable in the protection of the safety of the worker. Okay. Next, when we look at Regulation 851, so for all the workplaces that meet the definition of an industrial establishment, Regulation 851, there is a couple sections in there. Section 21 does talk about lighting. Okay, when we think about ensuring that there's adequate lighting, have you ever tried to lift something like where you don't have good visual feedback? Like sometimes it can be awkward, or it does take, it does cause people to be, um, you know, take a little bit of a slower approach, more cautious approach, right? And how that could lead to more static postures or long durations, what have you. Okay. In terms of section 45, this is the section in Regulation 851 that does talk about material handling in a way that does not endanger a worker. So that is one of the main pieces of legislation that the Ministry of Labor does quote when they come into industrial establishments when there is MSD risks, okay, in the workplace. Then finally, there are some standards that we will talk about and we'll be sending out as part of those standard references. We can't give you a copy of the standard, but nonetheless, the CSA 412 and 1004. This is both the workplace ergonomic standard as well as the office ergonomic standard. There's a bunch of great design guidelines in there, as well as really embedding your MSD prevention programs into all of your workplace health and safety programs. So it really does take a PDCA approach to making sure that we do have a systematic approach to managing musculoskeletal disorder hazards within your workplace. Okay, which is very empirical when we look at warehouse distribution, because when we look in those areas specifically, there's a lot of times where change management becomes so important that we take a step back and we review, are we creating any additional MSD hazards? And how can we put in controls to minimize those risks? There's also the ISO standard that is listed there. Ministry of Labor also has guidelines. And then finally, the MSD prevention guideline for Ontario. Nathan and I cannot say enough good things about this this website. There's a bunch of great resources. There's good training. There's good assessment tools. There's good flyers. It's really comprehensive, but it also is set up in a way that regardless of background in terms of MSD prevention and ergonomic background, that it is very user friendly and does offer it in a very layman's terms way. Okay. The last point here is the Ministry of Labor, so MLITSD, over the last couple initiative schedules do have and have had blitzes focused on ergonomics. Okay. Now, as you can see on the left-hand side, ergonomics in the warehouse, it is something that just wrapped up last month. However, the Ministry of Labor has announced, and it is a little bit on their website, kind of primarily outlining that the industrial initiative for 23-24 will be focused in and around material handling. Phase 1 will be focused from April 1st until March 31st next year. It's really focused on the education, outreach, and awareness, okay? Where the Public Health and Safety Association, which WSPS being one of them, will help support that initiative. So look for additional safety connections specific to the blitzes that are coming. Phase 2, starting in May of this year, will be the focus inspection blitz. So inspectors will be coming in looking for compliance, whether it's in and around lifting device, workplace layout, manual material handling, storage systems, automation, machine guarding. Okay, so as we're going through some of the safety connection items, it's definitely a lot of overlap that you will see in the blitz schedule. Now, the other item that is a part of the material handling area that we kind of loosely touch on is the risk that we have in many of our warehouse distribution areas where workers could be at risk of being struck by or crushed by moving equipment. Okay. So it's very important when we look at workplace design in this area that we're considering these risk factors as well. And it is something that the Ministry of Labor will be blitzing and we will be supporting from an educational standpoint. And we also have some service offerings that we will discuss towards the end, how we can help support you with some of these items. Okay. So in terms of the presentation, what we're really going to be focused on here is mobile equipment, material handling, and equipment and layout design. Now, we do mention on this slide on purpose about the MSD prevention program. Now, we're not going into necessarily specific slides on that today. It is something that WSPS does help in terms of if it's something that you're looking for support on. However, when we're thinking about as we're getting into the next slides here, and we're going into these different function areas, whether it's mobile equipment, manual material handling, the design of your work area, is ensuring that we have that step back to ensure that we are reviewing the risks as we're going through that change management is so important. And that's where an MSD prevention guideline and a lot of these risk factors that we're talking about up front here is way more cost efficient, and it's easier to implement controls when we're catching it in that design phase up front before implementation. Not to say that we don't have a duty to correct hazards and correct situations once it's been implemented. However, it is a lot easier to do it up front. Okay. So with that, we're going to pull in a poll here just as we get into the first section here on material handling. What types of equipment do you have within your workplace to move material? What types of equipment do you have in your workplace to move materials? A sit down trucks, stand up. So whether it's narrow reach, order pickers, tuggers, being C, D, low lifts, walkies, manual pallet jacks. Nathan, I still can't see the, for some reason my chat's not loading the poll option. So I'll give it a couple seconds, then I'll have you just let me know what the results are. I apologize everyone with the technical difficulties here.
Yeah, did you click on the polls icon there at the top, Josh?
Yeah.
Gets rid of the chat, that's the problem. Okay, I'll just read it out to you then. So currently 28% would be the highest. That's manual pallet jacks. We have 24% sit-down forklift, 21% stand-up forklift, 19% for low lift walkies, And then the lowest is the tuggers at 5%.
Okay, so we do have a really good variation. Okay, so with that, well, we're going to talk about that this point in some of the slides here, is that when we look at the different types of material handling equipment, they all pose different hazards, right? So getting into the mobile equipment consideration. So first off, okay, visibility and line of sight. Okay, so when we look at that in terms of visibility, think about the impact that has for the worker. Okay, so when we have trouble seeing, typically speaking, some things that I'm still seeing it saying still in slides
Yeah, I think we're having some
16.
issues with slides for some people. I'm not sure why. It's fine on my end, and it appears that some people are having that issue and some people aren't. And I'm not 100% sure on what the technical issue is there.
Okay.
But I'll just suggest you could try logging out and logging back in. You could try web version versus the app version, or vice versa, depending on what the issue is. But apologize for what those technical issues are. I'm not sure if it's on our end or your end. I don't know, but yeah, we'll have to kind of move forward, unfortunately, and maybe Camille in the background, if you could kind of keep an eye on that chat. Sorry, Josh, go
Okay.
ahead.
No, perfect. So I am seeing some notes in the chat here that some people are good on there. We are on slide 20. So again, when we're looking at the visibility, just to kind of finish that thought that I was going off of, is sometimes when visibility becomes an issue, the operator workers will try to compensate for that, whether it's twisting, turning. So think about things such as mirrors on your lift trucks. Maybe it's ensuring that we have adequate lighting. Okay, spotter requirements. One of the scenarios that I've seen in some of the workplaces where when we were using double bay racking, or where it was racking that was back to back that you were loading from one end, we had actually, to help with some of the visibility items, not only was there a spotter, but we actually put a camera on the forks to help with seeing where we're lined up, right? So it helped in terms of not trying to overcompensate in terms of some of the body positioning. I did see the comment that just came in the chat too. Mirrors helps a ton. Okay, as we've already mentioned, okay, in terms of traffic management, right, is do we have we established the right of passage for both pedestrians and equipment? Okay, and this is really, it's a case by case basis. It's one of those things where we do encourage you to go back to your workplace from an musculoskeletal disorder, um risk factors. Like, think about when you're operating a vehicle or operating a mobile equipment, and our tasks, we have so much ask that's already kind of being asked of us as operators, right? There's so much focus, there's a lot of, we're operating controls and whatnot, but then also kind of keeping your head on a swivel in terms of like people being in close proximity. That's where it's important that we do have controls in place to the best of our ability separate pedestrians from mobile equipment in the workplace to help minimize that. Now, again, this is something that it's case by case, and that's where, where there's shared aisles, for example. I mean, many of us have probably been in big box stores where they utilize different caution tapes or bollards or what have you to kind of separate whether when there is a scenario where mobile equipment's being used in the same work area as pedestrians. But nonetheless, it's one of those assessments that we do strongly encourage individuals to kind of, or for you to go back to your workplace to complete that assessment. Finally, to aisles free of obstructions, whether that's for, when we think about an obstruction, that could be maybe there's parcels or there's a skid in the way where now from an ergonomic standpoint, I'm having to take alternative, locations to get to that point where I need to get to, or maybe it's blocking visibility, or we think about also the whole element of it, when we do have walkways or we do have areas that are blocked, that individuals will take will take an alternative route where maybe they're stepping into a drive aisle. Okay, so definitely some additional factors more from a safety standpoint there, but nonetheless very important for us to look at. Now, in terms of maybe some of the recommendations we can make, right? Making the appropriate selection of the equipment. So consider the capacity, width, power source, control functions of your equipment. The thing that we are seeing with lift trucks just in general from a both a ergonomic, well, musculoskeletal disorder and both a psychosocial standpoint is some of the controls now, like, they are switching. Like some of them are going to more like the finger controls versus the lever. Think about that from a psychosocial standpoint too, in terms of training, where there is that whole getting used to the new controls. Now, when we see power source, like the ergonomic considerations for that, like maybe your workplace uses propane, lift trucks where we're asking workers to exchange tanks manually. Well, the tanks can be heavy, right? So think about how we can better optimize that workplace or that task to minimize the risks associated with that. Also, with power source, you think about electrical or battery power source. Like if it is a task that maybe in your workplace you are internally, you know, completing some of that preventative maintenance of your battery where you're pulling battery trays out to maybe top them up, what have you. There's also many safety factors associated with that, but also those battery trays can be very difficult to pull and push, right? um, and to that point that we've already kind of talked about is when we think about the ergonomic considerations and MSD factors for counterbalance versus narrow reach versus walkie versus tugger versus any of these mobile equipment, there's different risk factors associated with all of them, whether it's postures, whether it's force, whether for counterbalance, maybe you're sitting in one place for long durations, or narrow reach, you're standing in one place for long durations versus a walkie where, you're kind of moving around and you're kind of getting that flexibility. But that point, maybe it's causing positional, like awkward postures and what have you, just in that rate, right? So it is important that we're looking at our overall design of the workplace for that. Next, clearance. So as we are removing product from the racking structure or just clearance throughout your warehouse distribution area, clearance becomes a big concern in terms of when there's not enough. Typically speaking, as we've talked about from a postural standpoint, you'll have operators that not only are they maybe not as efficient because we need to slow down to make sure that we are clearing kind of the obstacles, but also we're compensating for that visibility where maybe it's not to a point where we need a spotter, but it is something that I need to kind of look from both edges as I'm operating that narrow reach truck or that counterbalance lift truck to make sure that there is clearance. Driving surfaces. Okay, so we want to make sure that our driving surfaces are maintaining good working condition. When we get into workplaces that maybe the surfaces are not the clearest, it can promote vibration on the operator. We've already talked about the static postures associated with this, but on operating the different types of mobile equipment. But on that note, right, consider how we can implement a job rotation by ensuring that it's in a way that different job demands and muscle groups are utilized. So an example of this is maybe you have an operator that operates a lift truck, to help kind of pre-stage material. And maybe they also help with the delivery line side. That's one thing that I've seen in the past that has really helped, where instead of having a designated person that's just doing your lift truck operation for the 8 hours a shift and one person that's kind of doing the picking, kind of getting the material either on a tugger or line side, what have you, that we're rotating those jobs amongst workers so that they get that break versus static sitting for 8 hours versus I'm also helping with some of the picking and what have you that gets me kind of up and active. So think about how maybe there are candidates of job rotation within your workplace. Okay. Now we're going to pull in another poll here when we get into the lifting side. How much lifting is too much? We got a poll here. We got 5 kilograms, 10, 20, 30, 40 kilograms. I've got no idea. What do you think on this? And this one, Nathan, it is back in the chat. So it looks like I got functionality back. So we got a lot of people answering 20 kilograms. Interesting. So give it a couple more moments here. Ah, I like Rob's point here. Okay, and I tend to agree. It depends. There's so many factors that go into a lift. Okay. So just from a high level, we're going to get into these individually for you to consider it as we're kind of looking at our warehouse distribution area. But think about like the height of the lift, right? And when we talk about that from an ergo standpoint, it's the vertical displacement. Am I lifting from the floor to shoulder height? Is it just in around elbow height? Like what is that total lift distance? The weight of the object. Okay, horizontal reach. So how far is that load away from the body? As loads move away from the body, our lifting demands or capabilities do go down. Handholds, are we able to get a firm grip on the item? Okay, does allow us to maintain a strong a lift. Sometimes awkward products, or if there's no handles, can also make it very difficult to kind of get that grip and ultimately lift. How often? So how how often and how long? So frequency, duration, as we talked about. Does the lift promote any awkward postures? Think about footing. Can I get over top that load and have a nice bounce, stable lift? And just individual factors, as we talked about, whether it's age, sex, sleep, diet, exercise level. These are all different factors that can impact the acceptable load, and really it can be very different. Obviously based on the individual, but that's where, when we think about our workplaces, how can we set up our conditions to be most optimal for all of our workers? Okay, so some considerations for lifting. First things first, can we eliminate the lift? Is it necessary? Okay, the one item to go back to when you work at your workplace, and it's definitely something I've seen based on material flow within where I came from in automotive, where sometimes we were doing lifts that were not necessary, or we were double handling parts or triple handling parts, and it didn't make sense. When we changed our workplace design, we minimized how many times that part or that product was being handled. Okay, when we think about the weight, can we split the load? Okay. When we think about splitting the load, is it maybe it's changing up our dunnage into smaller totes so that we minimize the risk of people overfilling? Maybe we engineer it out in terms of providing just smaller totes where they can overfill it. Definitely something to think about. Having a standard, though, to help define pack density and safe lifting procedures can be very, very, very important, because typically speaking, when we see individuals fill totes and overfill loads, they have good intentions. They want to get the product to the line. We want to make sure that we're meeting our customers' demands, or fulfilling our orders, what have you. But ultimately, sometimes we're not recognizing the risk that we're taking on by doing that, right? Consider, if it is something that's too heavy, maybe it's a two-person lift versus one-person lift, or maybe we need to get a lifting device in to help with it. Okay. In terms of frequency and duration, that next point, can we manipulate the workstation that allows adequate recovery? Okay, as we've talked about, maybe whether that's through job rotation, maybe it's through providing different micro breaks based on doing different tasks. Okay. Can we minimize doubling of materials handling? So we've already talked about that. In terms of posture, is there a sustained or awkward posture? Okay, can we change the workstation to eliminate that need? A good example of this, and I believe it's on the next slide, it kind of ties in this horizontal reach, is can we provide tools that helps bring in the load closer to the body so that maybe people aren't overextending? Okay, or can we change the way our workplace is designed in terms of the way our workers are picking the products, or getting the products that's more conducive to them? Okay, in terms of height, we've talked about this already a little bit. Can we position the load, okay, so at a better height? So consider how we can put in different controls, whether it's different, like maybe like a bin riser, or like tilt tables, conveyors, what have you, to help minimize kind of that, having an abnormal or vertical displacement that's kind of outside of the human capabilities. Okay, keeping things kind of in that, between the shoulders and knees of the workers. Horizontal reach, as we've talked about already, is can we bring the loads closer to the worker? Tilt tables, okay. And then finally, the handholds. Does the material have handles? Does it promote neutral shoulder, back, and arm postures? Is it something that maybe we need to split into different dunnage so that it does have handles, what have you? It's interesting, when doing assessments, ergonomic assessments in the past, I've seen where our lifting capabilities can actually change upwards of 15-20% based on handholds being present and being able to get a grip on things. So it does make a very, very a big impact. Okay. And then finally, foot positioning. Can we get over top that load so that we can have a strong, stable lift? Now, in terms of the floor, it is important that it is in good working condition. You know, do those inspections, make sure there's not like water or oil or other debris that may be slippery for the individual, as traction does play a big role in being able to complete the lift. Okay. Also consider footwear that promotes good traction. Okay, making sure that we do have individuals that are buying, CSA approved boots, or slip resistant boots as well. Then finally, safe lifting training, so ensuring that we are training our operators or training our workers to ensure that they are following good lifting techniques. And also, if it's something that maybe, as we're kind of going through this and we're not sure, maybe something we're not exactly sure on how much load should be lifted, maybe a formal ergonomic assessment is required, right? And that's definitely something that WSPS can assist you with if you need to have a ergonomist such as Nathan go out and do those assessments to help with that. Okay, so our fifth poll here: what factors may impact the appropriate acceptable load? Select all that apply. So is it height, weight, frequency, duration, handholds? Yeah, getting a lot of responses coming in. Perfect. Looks like give you a couple more moments here. Everyone's saying F, all the above. Awesome. Great job, everyone. So the last section before I hand it over to Nathan, just to go through here, is also in terms of material handling, is the use of carts. Okay, so within our warehouse distribution areas, carts may be utilized as a control. However, we also need to recognize that these may have additional MSD factors from pushing and pulling or from the use of carts in the workplace. So just some areas just to look at, okay, is load weight. Okay, so how much are we pushing? Okay. What's the duration of those sustained efforts? Similar to lifting, there are recommendations in terms of how much we can push for how long based on a number of different factors where a formal ergonomic assessment can help clarify that. In terms of posture, okay, and I've seen this, I mean, many of us have probably came across this in different facets, whether it's in the workplace or outside the workplace, is think about the postures required for pushing. Does it promote strong neutral postures, whether it's with our arms, shoulders, what have you? Okay. Is our handle present? Is the handle at appropriate height? Like I look at this card on the far left-hand side. I've seen cards where the handle was too low, which it was causing additional factors as we were pushing, right? Because it was causing the worker to become outreached and get these awkward postures. Okay. Another area to kind of look at is casters. Okay. First off, size, whether that's both width and height, can dramatically change the amount of push force required to move that load. So when we think about, just naturally speaking, when we think about the larger the wheel, typically it can be easier. But the width of the wheel also plays a factor in that as well, as you could have increased amount of friction based on how much surface area is contacting the floor with that caster. Okay. Um, Also material height type of casters. So again, a softer material may be more difficult to push versus something that is a little bit harder. And then swivel caster location. This is something that, you know, ran into a bunch of times, definitely something to look at in the workplace. Think about how difficult it is if we have a cart, let's say, with 4 swivels. Like it looks like this cart that in the first one on the left-hand side here does have 4 swivels if I actually get a pointer out. That definitely can make it more difficult to kind of navigate as we're going around corners or we're pushing down a straightaway. Also thinking about where swivel caster location should be, okay, based on the load that you are transporting. Okay. We want to make sure that loads are stable. So as we're using carts, that they are secured to that carts, there isn't a risk of it becoming loose or becoming a hazard in its own way. In terms of visibility and clearance, when we overload a car and clearance becomes an issue where people can't see around, it does help. Well, it doesn't help. It drives postural and human interactions in terms of what can we see, what can't we see. So think about that in terms of the loading, unloading, loading, and safe use. When using a cart, if the floor conditions do have areas that have been broken up, that can impact and make it difficult to push over. So terrain does become important. So do those inspections, look at your floor in the workplace, identify areas that need to be corrected. And similar to lifting, footwear does play a big factor in us being able to generate the force. Okay. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Nathan for the last section of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Josh. And thanks for all the info. I'm going to build on that now and just talk about some specific things related to more design. Now, Josh did touch on some of this with, things like carts and that sort of thing, but I'll get a little bit more in depth, as much as we can in this session here today about design considerations. So before I do, though, we'll get another poll launched here. And the question is, which of the following have you had issues with that resulted in worker complaints or discomforts? We'll launch that for you guys. We'll give you a second to get that poll going. The machinery tooling, workbench, work surface height, flow rack, storage racking, palletizing, dunnage, or other. Interested to see what's the winner here. Looks like so far, workbench, work surface height is taking the lead. I'll give you another few seconds just to fill that out. Yeah, definitely workbench, work surface height. That's a common one that we deal with as ergonomists for sure. Flow rack, storage racking, it's close there with 22%, palletizing 23%. Yeah, and those would probably be the top three, I would say, is that work surface height, the racking, the palletizing. Those are the three probably most common for sure. Excellent. Thanks everybody for answering that. And a follow-up poll to that for the next one, maybe a little bit harder to answer, or maybe not, depending on your comfortability with answering this. Have you ever had to spend money to retrofit or correct a poor design? Yes, no, or prefer not to say. And a resounding yes for most people there for these results, which is not a surprise at all, which is, what we're really trying to work with companies on is trying to design out these ergonomic issues before they make it to the floor and before they get used. And so that's really why, a big reason why we wanted to have this session today, is to talk about that sort of thing and to really start that conversation with you guys. So thanks for answering that and answering honestly. And it is very common that people have to spend money after the fact, after something, poor design went to floor. So this is one of the big ones. I'm just going to touch on some of these big ones really that you guys have already highlighted, that you have had issues with, and really kind of discuss each one. So poor racking is a big one, that design, right? That really contributes to things like overextending, right? If we think about that top shelf in this example, or any racking, for example, might require that there's some overextending of the shoulders. So we're now in some awkward postures of the shoulder to access those items. And thinking about that kind of 6'5" person versus the kind of 5 foot flat person, and what that difference in posture might be. Heavier awkward loads in poor positions, right? So we've got these kind of heavier or awkward large. Josh talked a little bit about those sort of awkward loads that a lot of you guys might have to handle in those warehousing distribution. You guys store a lot of different things of all shapes and sizes. So in those kind of big, awkward, maybe off balance items that you have to handle, those can become a problem. And where those are placed in that racking can be an issue. If they're too high or too low, all of a sudden we're now adding those awkward postures with that awkward load as well. So bending to access those low items, right? So now we're talking about that lower shelf, or maybe even the floor in some examples, right? Where you're bending, getting in awkward back postures. Tim, racking should ideally have a PSR design before being built to address some of these issues. Yeah, and a PSR really, for the most part, really looks at the safety of things, not necessarily always considering ergonomics fully there. So, looking at that from an ergonomic design standpoint and actually getting proper measurements and design of heights of those racks and that sort of thing, which we'll talk about in a second here. Thanks for that comment, Tim. Bending, twisting, right, kneeling. If we talk about, reaching under that kind of low shelf in the racking, maybe where you have to access something that's kind of under a shelf, a lot of awkward kind of postures that you have to get in order to access those items. So it might be bending, twisting, maybe even kneeling or squatting, right? Force an awkward posture to remove items if items might be getting caught in the racking. Some of those kind of metal graded rackings, items can get caught in those sometimes, or maybe kind of things are bumped up against other product where they get caught and you have to kind of unwedge them, and there's some significant force potentially there. Use of one of those kind of poles that I've seen out there in some warehousing distribution areas, where you're pulling with kind of a metal pole to kind of dislodge something, and there might be some high forces involved with that. And a lot of times the design of these poles are really, you're doing that in like a pinch grip, because it's a kind of a thin, small metal pole with usually not the best handle or the best kind of end of it to kind of help pull things. So something more like almost like a rake design would be maybe something to look at in that case. Force and awkward posture. Sorry, I mentioned that for removing items. So that's definitely something that comes into play. Flow rack as well, where you may have rollers that come dislodged, or a box or a part that gets kind of caught in the rollers. That can be an issue as well. And then there's some force that's required to remove that. Clearance issues as well. So Josh talked a little bit about this as well, but that head clearance, if you're reaching underneath something, under a shelf, and then you have to kind of come out, there's potential to bump your head. If you're reaching into a flow rack and you have, like this example on the left there, his head is bumping into that package or potentially a cross rail, right? And so what's the head clearance required there so that doesn't happen? Designing things with that in mind. And then hand clearance as well. So if you have to reach into this rack for the boxes and there's not enough room for your hands on either side, you're going to have potential pinch points against the racking or against other parts or products. And so designing with that hand clearance in mind. The names for A, B, and C. This is just a snapshot from a diagram that we have at WSPS, and it really just shows the different heights. So bottom shelf, top shelf, and then horizontal. Those are the three things that it's looking at there, which are three factors that are very important when it comes to racking. So to get a little bit more in depth, and I can't go into a great detail as far as how you can properly design a flow rack or racking in a session like this, because it requires understanding, the products that you're using. It requires understanding an understanding of anthropometrics and what that means. So I'll go very kind of high level into this so that you kind of understand the approach, I guess, as far as ergonomic principles goes. So when we look at racking, really the biggest things that we need to consider are sort of that top shelf and the bottom shelf, right? Because that's where the extreme postures are. And so our goal is really to look at how do we design this flow rack so that most people can perform this task of accessing, pulling items out, putting items into this rack without getting into those kind of awkward postures, staying as neutral as possible. And so generally from an anthropometric standpoint, which really just means the kind of study of human measurement, we're looking at making it so that 90% of the population can perform that task. And so we're considering from that kind of 5th percentile shortest person up to the tallest percentile, 95th percentile person. That range is what we're looking at. So with that, we're trying to reduce the bending for that low shelf, and that's kind of our focus there. So really our limiting user is that tallest worker. So we want to make sure that taller worker can access items without bending too much. And so we would use, for items that are frequently handled, we might look at knuckle height for that tallest individual at 95th percentile male is what we would look at. So knuckle height for that person, not going lower than that for that design of the rack for frequently used items. If it's infrequent, we might be able to get away with something like knee height, where there's a little bit more back bend, but there's not a lot of access, not frequent access to those items. So we can probably get away with it a little bit, as long as we're not getting into really heavy items and that sort of thing. Now, for that reach diagram, you can look at the CSA reference, which we'll have at the end, the CSA 1004, which has reference to some reach guidelines you can look at. And there's also some reach guidelines on MSD prevention guideline, msdprevention.com as well, which we'll reference at the end. So that's the bottom, right? So that low shelf, we're really looking at that tallest user, trying to limit that bending, because guess what? If they can bend without much back bending, or they can reach that item without much back bending, then the shorter people can as well. On the reverse of that, for that top shelf, we're looking at reducing the awkward shoulder postures to kind of access and reach up high, right? And so again, for those frequent items, we're looking at trying to keep things within kind of shoulder level for that shorter percentage of the population, or that 5th percentile female, for that upper rack and shelf. And that's for, again, that infrequent type item. So about shoulder level is where we would want to keep it. If we get into those more occasional, less frequent items that are handled, we might be able to get away with kind of going into their higher reach items, where we're looking at kind of their maximum vertical reach, where they can access items without getting on their tiptoes, trying to avoid those kind of extreme neck and shoulder postures to access items. But kind of that bottom bullet point here is really trying to keep things within the power zone. And that power zone generally is kind of within our knuckle to shoulder region. And if we can keep most things within that region, we can design our flow racks to achieve that, we're going to be doing well. And so those are kind of some general principles which we would offer for that racking. As far as the vertical positions, if we look at the horizontal, again, we're looking at that shorter female population to kind of be our limiting user, because if that shorter person can reach something, and we design it to them, then most everyone can access and reach those items. So that's a big one there. Again, looking at that sort of forward reach, that full arm's length reach as being that maximum position for that shorter population. And we could look at kind of specific numbers for this as far as anthropometrics, but it really takes kind of knowing how to interpret anthropometrics, how to use those safely and use them well so that they can be designed well. And so working with someone like an ergonomist or someone who has knowledge of that sort of a thing. Considerations for handling assists. So definitely, Josh talked a lot about kind of material handling and ways that we can kind of eliminate or get rid of, or at least reduce some of the effects of that, right? So a lift assist or a crane or a hoist, are those available, or can we implement those in this scenario to reduce the issues there and kind of reduce that manual material handling? And Melanie, your question about the power zone could mean different things to different references, but generally we would say that's kind of within the knuckle to shoulder range, knee to shoulder range within there. So lift assist, crane, hoist, right? Can we eliminate that lift? Can we use some type of a device to actually remove that lift? But then there's things we need to consider with that design as well, because often I have come across, and I'm sure Josh has as well, where we implement a lift assist, or a lift assist has been kind of put in, workers weren't involved in kind of trialing, design did not include ergonomics, that sort of thing. And all of a sudden we've got a lift that requires some high force to manipulate and move. And now we've just traded that lift for a high force push-pull. And so that's not a great condition either. And often also what we get is now we've kind of removed a lift and the force might not be high, but now we have awkward postures to operate that lift. I've seen some vacuum lifts, right, where we're handling bags or something like that, and we're lifting them off pallets, but our hands are kind of up here operating that lift assist. And now we've got an awkward posture of the shoulder. So again, we're sort of trading off our MSD hazards one for the other. And so trying to design those things out before that gets live onto the floor is something to really consider. And we're really trying to push people towards. Pallet lift tables, we kind of mentioned that already, but one big flag that I see with those is, do they go low enough? And there's a lot of pallet lifters out there that really, they sit about 6 inches or more off the floor, and then you've got the pallet height, which is about 6 inches as well. And so now there's a whole foot potentially where they're off the floor, and now that top of that pallet to access items is quite high. So do they go low enough? And I've seen people recess those into the ground. I've seen well-designed pallet lifters that will actually go, very close to the floor. And so making sure that you're looking at these things and designing that into the equipment that you purchase and put on the floor. So considering those kind of low and high positions, right? Pallet lifters are great because they stop that bending, like you can see in that top right picture there, right? You can access those items at a good height. Again, as long as it goes low enough, as long as that top of the pallet isn't too high. Pallet and bin tip equipment, Josh mentioned this very quickly, really just helping to orient things towards you so that you're reducing that horizontal reach. So that might be something to consider that really helps and assists with orientation, with posture, position, and handling of things. Of course, the motorized pallet jack, right? If you've got a scenario where you're having to manually push a full load of something, a full load of product with a pallet, those can be quite heavy. And I still see this very often, right? Where those forces that we measure are quite high. And you're exposing your workers to that high risk scenario. And so we want to make sure that we have ways to kind of manage that. And so maybe it's a motorized pallet jack or something like that, instead of a manual pallet jack. height adjustable carts. Can we move and handle items in a way where instead of lifting per se, maybe we can slide them on and off a shelf onto a cart that's height adjustable if we can adjust it to that right height? Or can we at least use that cart to help lift things at a better height and position and then reduce that carry as well, right? Exoskeletons getting a lot of attention right now. So the caveat I'll say with this is that the research is still not definitive. There are companies that are using these, and I have had quite a bit of experience with specific exoskeletons, mostly for kind of reducing overhead work, not a whole lot with kind of the ones that will help with lifting, because the passive exoskeletons are really what are most common out there right now. And that's basically those exoskeletons that are meant to wear that are not battery operated. There's no actuation that is kind of powered. It's all passive, meaning it's going to offload the muscles. So the shoulder is going to be offloaded if I'm reaching up. My back's going to be offloaded if I'm bending down, that sort of thing. And so research not definitive, a lot of positive research saying that, you know, it does help in a lot of ways and certain applications to reduce some of that muscle activation, which is definitely positive. But we don't fully know, you know, if there's any kind of negative effects of that, like atrophy of the muscles from sort of not using those muscles, or if you're holding your arms up all the time now using an exoskeleton, is there blood flow issues, that sort of thing. And so there's more to be done there, but definitely something to kind of potentially look into as long as it's trialed well and maybe kind of partnered with an ergonomist or a research partner. Cobots and robots, also a lot of attention, and probably many of you have these kind of out and about on your floor, helping with reducing some of the material handling issues that you may have had. So definitely something we're seeing a lot more of and a lot of good success, and we're going to see more and more of. As far as push-pull goes, Josh did talk about sort of cart design and that sort of thing. Just to add to that, you know, there are some specific wheels that are designed to reduce force. Ones that I'm aware of are the kind of Twergo, funky name, but look it up. Twergo wheel, it's more like a double kind of wheel together. Rotocasters, those are two examples. Depending on the application, may not work for everywhere, but something to look into, right? Making sure that you have those proper force reducing wheels, if that is an issue as far as the force to push that and pull any carts that you might have. Josh talked about a bit of handle as well, making sure that's at the right height, making sure it's away from the cart itself as well, because then you're not going to be banging your shins, making sure you have that foot clearance, that sort of thing. But maybe you can also reduce any kind of push-pull using things like your powered devices in your pallet trucks, walkies, tugger, forklift. AGVs, right? A lot out there now as well, especially in the warehousing distribution areas where these automatic vehicles are kind of roaming around, transporting things to and from, and that's reducing a lot of kind of fork truck traffic, but also reducing some kind of handling as far as pushing and pulling and that sort of thing as well. So that might be something to look into. And then use of conveyors finally there, right? So maybe instead of pushing and pulling, we can have a conveyor that helps kind of transport something, whether it's portable or kind of fixed. And common types of tasks that you guys are exposed to as well would be these things: packing, unpacking, loading, unloading, palletizing, sorting, all these types of tasks that are very common in your areas. And when we did the poll at the start there, as far as that, the things that you guys may have run into concerns with and complaints, it's that workstation height. And so again, there's things that we need to consider in this. We really need to help design these things out before they get to the floor. And again, this is not a design course, so I can't convey all the information that I want to convey to you, and giving specifics as far as heights and reaches and that sort of thing gets a little bit tricky because there are these factors we have to consider, like the type of work being done. So what is the work? Is it heavy? Is it light? Is it more precision? Because that changes the height that we would want to work at. You know, if we look at the bottom left picture there, that is from the MSD Prevention Guideline website, and you can find similar workstation height guidelines for CSA as well, Z 1004. But you know, a precision task would be 5 to 10 centimeters above elbow height. Your light task might be 5 to 10 centimeters below elbow height. And then your heavy task would be sort of in that 15 to 25 centimeters below elbow height. And then the question becomes, whose elbow height, right? So that becomes the issue. Whose elbow height are we using and referencing with this? So that's why these guidelines give you these examples in a range, because we're trying to accommodate most people in that range. But the key is really just trying to stay within that range, because then most people can do that, right? Now, if we look at average height as kind of our range, or as our reference point, I should say, well, that might be okay for a lot of jobs, but it might actually be making it harder for some people, right? And because if you're designing to the average, well, often it's going to be 50% of the population it might not be good for. And so we have to consider that our population, and consider the type of work being done, the size and the variability of the product, right? So when we look at the height, the line height that we might want to design, are we considering that product itself, or are we just, if we're using elbow height, are we just using that as a reference when we really have to look at whether our hand height is going to be handling that product, right? If we have a 30 centimeter high box, that's 30 centimeters above that line height that we designed to. So is that still appropriate? Is that the right height and size for the size and the parts that we're working on? If there's tooling required, does that affect the line height that we need, right? The orientation of that tool, are we using, more of a pistol grip, or are we using an inline grip, and kind of how does that play to the hand heights that we're working at, and making sure we're designed to that. Jeff, I'll come to your question at the end if I can on the exoskeletons. We'll loop back to that. So sequence flow of work product, we have to consider that as well. What's the person before you doing? What's the person after you doing? Is their work height that you're working at is the same as theirs? Is that appropriate? Does that need to be adjusted? Is there some change that we need to put in place there? Foot clearance, this one gets missed sometimes, right? So if your feet are banging up against a rail, a wall, any kind of guard or something like that, and that limits how close you can get to the line that you're working at, that could potentially add 6 inches or more to that reach that you have to do things, and all of a sudden you're in a slight back bend for that entire working process. And so we have to make sure we don't miss that one. And then footprint available, right? So that's going to impact, what kind of footprint you have available, and how that turns and affects kind of the position and the layout of your workstations. Some things to consider as far as how we can kind of achieve some of these neutral postures as best as possible is, can we first and foremost look at height adjustability in our work surfaces? And there's a lot of work that's been done, a lot of improvement on industrial type workstations that can adjust height-wise, right, for different users, different heights and sizes. Because let's face it, that 5-foot worker versus the 6'5" worker, very different postures and positions when working at the same line, right? And then if you can't do that, how do we manage that? We can raise up a shorter person, but we can't lower a taller person without putting them in awkward positions. So maybe it's something to consider as far as like an elevated platform in certain areas. Obviously considering that slip, trip, and fall risk and that sort of thing, and making sure those controls are in place. But that could be a way to kind of approach and consider. Maybe there's removable platforms you can put in place. Conveyors, rollers to reduce the reach and improve the workflow, right? If the work can come to you as opposed to you coming to the work, or you reaching to the work, it's going to help a lot in reducing some of those postures and positions. And again, we mentioned those pallet lift tables, but also some of them that rotate as well, right? Great that they go up and down, but if they can rotate, now we don't have to walk around that pallet or reach across that pallet. It can rotate. We can have those items close to us. Dunnage design is a big one. If the dunnage that you're working with has flip down sides, and that allows you to kind of access items a lot easier without having to kind of reach over one of those walls, or even if the walls can be removable, right? Better access to the pieces of work or the parts that you're accessing and that sort of thing. So dunnage design is a big thing. The other thing as well with dunnage is a lot of times they have lids or section dividers, and these can often be over-designed and over-engineered, and they are too heavy. And people are lifting them awkwardly, right? Arms out here, and kind of handling them, and it becomes very awkward. And so there's awkward postures combined with those heavy lifts, and so that can be a very common issue. So maybe it's looking at getting them to be lighter. Maybe they can be sectioned into kind of 2 sections instead of 1, and that sort of thing. So looking at design from that standpoint as well. Rotating lift tables are perfect for pallet building. Yes, exactly. Those palletizing tasks, right? Where they can go up and down, you can turn them around, and it really reduces the MSD concerns there for sure. Talk about some layout considerations. Won't get into this a whole lot, but just a few things. Josh talked about it already a little bit with the fork truck side of things and the mobile equipment side of things, but really trying to reduce some of that, designing again this out with how the work is planned and how the floor plan is laid out, as far as minimizing those long duration backwards driving stints, because again, it's that, as you see in the picture, right? It's that neck rotation and back twisting potentially. Some fork trucks are designed a little bit with some rotation in the seat. So when you're driving backwards, the seat actually can rotate a little bit. Not a whole lot, but enough that it really does reduce that a little bit. So that could be something to look into as far as a rotational seat, as long as it doesn't impact, foot pedal, gas pedal, that sort of thing. But really trying to design things so that we can reduce the long duration. So maybe we're using other methods such as tuggers, tow motors, stackers, walkies, AGVs, that sort of thing, to reduce those long drives where we have to be driving backwards, because it is hard on the individual for neck shoulder, especially if you're doing it, on and off for the whole shift and there's no job rotation. Keeping loads lower if possible, right? So if the load is lower, then maybe we can do a little more forwards driving, looking for those opportunities. I know that's not always the case, and efficiency can be an issue. And then Josh mentioned as well, utilizing cameras, right? So whether it's backup or forward cameras, looking at those devices to see, can they help reduce some of those postures and positions that we have to be handling and managing through the day. Staging and storage and loading zones. These are areas where I've seen a lot of issues in that it's that repetition. And so it's a lot of quick turning, a lot of kind of rotation of the steering wheel. You're grabbing something, you're turning, you're dropping it, and you're repeating that rinse and repeat basically for a quarter or a shift or whatever it is. And it's a lot of repetitive movement. And so designing that layout to kind of minimize that as possible. Again, we're getting back to that foundational, right? Design is the most proactive thing that you can do. If you can design out the ergonomic issues or the MSD issues using ergonomic principles from the get-go, you're going to have a lot of success, and it's going to have that trickle-down effect, right? So designing the layout to minimize the number of turns that are required, which requires a little bit of analysis and a little bit of time consuming, but the payoff might be there, right? And lastly are some tooling considerations. So scanning, a very common task, a very common thing that is done in your environments, and maybe you can look at the handheld versus the wearable. I've seen kind of a ring or wrist cuff type scanners that really helps reduce some of that grabbing and gripping of the scanning that can be repetitive, can be an issue. If a scanner is located up high, maybe some shoulder reaches that you're reducing if you can have a wearable one. Again, maybe doesn't apply everywhere, but might be something to look into. But also having that sort of home position or a scanner on a balancer so that the individual doesn't have to continually grip and hold that device as well. Taping guns, common tool as well, but first and foremost, can we automate? I've seen a lot of automation with taping nowadays, and a lot of good success with that. Saves a lot of time and energy. And often what I see with those devices is those sort of awkward shoulder and wrist postures, especially if where the taping, the surface where taping is occurring is too high. So now we're kind of up here operating with that awkward wrist and shoulder position. So making sure that the working height is good for that task, and that the tool that you're using, minimizes those postures and positions as well. So you might want to trial some different tape guns that have some different shapes and sizes to them as well. cordless drills, there might be some sub-assembly that some of you guys do. This gets into more manufacturing, but looking at, tool and target. So what is the device itself? Is it a pistol style? And then what's the direction of movement? So if you're using a pistol style gun, for example, and you're doing a vertical shot, well, your wrist is going to be in this position because you're pointing downwards, right? So can we use more of an inline tool where you're kind of gripping it this way? Your wrist can be more straight. So looking at that from that perspective. A whole lot more we can say on tools, but we'll leave it at that just because we are short for time and we want to get to your questions. And obviously this is not a full on design course. We really just wanted to give you guys some considerations. So here's some of the resources before we get into our Q&A. Really great resources, and you should be able to click on those and save those to your bookmarks. The first is ours, WSPS.ca. So many great resources for all things health and safety. All of our events are on there, all our courses, lots of materials on there and articles and things for you to check out. And you can definitely search ergonomics through that. And there is an ergonomics page, which you can get more info on that as well. MSDprevention.com, we mentioned that already. I did put that in the chat before, but such a great resource. Can't say enough about that as far as what's available to you, whether you are a joint health and safety committee member, health and safety coordinator or manager, all the way up to an ergonomist like myself. There are tons of resources on there, tons of different assessment tools, checklists, that sort of thing that can really help with the MSD issues that you are dealing with, or even just building a program, an MSD prevention program as well. And it's meant for companies of all shapes and sizes, right? From the small business to the large. Another one, right, the Ontario website, they have some materials there on material handling that would be helpful, and tying in ergonomics there as well. Check out that website as well to find inspection initiative information that Josh spoke to earlier, and the CSA 1004, which I spoke to and Josh spoke to as well. Not a free resource, but a resource that a lot of great things in there that can be helpful, again, from building a program all the way to the assessment tools. So those are our resources there. And let's turn it over now to a question and answer period. And I don't know if Josh or Camille, if you've been scanning the questions that have come in as I've been talking there, but unanswered questions kind of focusing on, I know, Jeff, you had a question about exoskeletons. So any recommendations for exoskeletons that address manual material handling? Yeah, so really, as I said, I wouldn't say that there is enough definitive information on these types of exoskeletons to say, I feel comfortable saying go with this exoskeleton or this one. I think there's certainly exoskeletons out there that could be worth looking into and trialing, working with a vendor. Just a caution that vendors are salespeople too, so they will basically want you to use their devices, and you're going to get all the positives and no negatives. So just caution that way. So I don't think I can really point you to a specific exoskeleton that helps with manual material handling at this point. But I also want to address that and say there could be some inherent issues with the design of your jobs too, if that's what you're kind of leaning on. And maybe there's other ways that you can address those manual material handling issues through some of the things that we spoke about already. Use of carts, use of lift assists, cobots, robots, AGVs, like all those sorts of things. I would exhaust those before we kind of rely on putting something on the human to kind of reduce that risk, right? There's sort of a divide in that with calling them PPE or a lift assist. And I think most people say they're more on the PPE side at this point. But yeah, they're just so new, and they're so fresh still on the market. And so, yeah, I would recommend kind of working closely with a vendor, working closely with an ergonomist, or at least somebody who has good knowledge on the ergonomic piece, and really just working closely with that for a trial. and working with your workers too, right? Because if we just go ahead and put something on someone and say, go use it, it's not going to go well for the most part. And I've seen that. So really including your workers in that process, in a trial, in a pilot, and kind of going that way. Anything to add to that, Josh?
No. I was gonna say too, like to your point, is like doing that trial can be important to kind of flush that out. The other thing too that, and I know we trialed them at one point, and I went through a trial with them, and one thing that we found too is there's quite a bit of costs associated with those two in terms of like upkeep, right? Because you got
Yes.
to replace the cylinders and whatnot. So like at that point, like when we did that assessment, we like when we started to do the math on like what we needed to do, how many workers we needed to do it, and then upkeep on it, it was actually the option we went with was doing like a workstation redesign, just because it was just the most sustainable and what made more sense.
Yeah.
But again, it kind of comes down to situation. It's a case by case basis.
Yeah, and sometimes there, like you said, there might be nothing else you can do, and you've exhausted all those opportunities. But I've seen that too, where companies, they kind of do the math, and it's like every person doing the job needs their own exoskeleton because of sanitary reasons. Nobody wants to share. Number two, because of fit, they don't have time to kind of fit and adjust things in between workers, and so if everybody needs their own, and then what's the cost of that? And it goes up pretty fast that way. So just some kind of cautions there. Other questions here. Let's see. Can existing work tables be turned into a height adjustable table? Are there any such options? You can buy the frames for basically the legs, or the frames for an adjustable workstation, and you can fit them with an existing work surface. I would just work with a vendor to see if that's compatible. You would have to make sure that it holds the weight of that surface. The weight that you use is required to be on that surface is a consideration too, right? Because if you're going to put hundreds of pounds on that table, well, maybe the frame itself needs to be kind of more heavy duty or something like that. And so I believe that is a possibility, and definitely worth looking into if that does save you some cost as far as that work surface goes. But I know that the cost of more industrial type height adjustable workstations has come down quite a bit. They're a lot more popular, and they're getting really good at designing those things well. So let's see if any other questions here. Jeff Hillier received some good Carrie, you received some good worker feedback on the lift suit. Excellent. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, definitely worth looking into. And again, caution moving forward, just with the use of an ergonomist or someone with that knowledge, right? And trialing that with worker feedback. Justin, is there any way to get into the presentation tomorrow? Okay, so it looks like Camille's already answered that for you, Justin. So it is full, but we'll probably be running that again. If you're seeing any questions here, Josh, just go ahead. Support belts. Okay, this is a good one. Do support belts give false security regarding lifting and trunk rotation? So I think you're talking about kind of lifting belts, almost like a weightlifting belt that you kind of see. We used to see them a lot, and we used to get this question all the time. They basically, for the most part, I would say, have gone by the wayside because for that reason, one of the reasons you say is it does give you that sort of false sense of security. But it also almost deactivates some of those kind of abdominal muscles that you might need to recruit and use. And so it changes how you're lifting, and also maybe potentially increases that sort of inter-abdominal pressure there. And so we need to make sure that we don't recommend them. We recommend not using them for that reason. And if you have to lift things that are heavy enough that you feel you need a lifting belt, then maybe it's too heavy. And so maybe we need a second person in there. Maybe we need to find another alternative way to lift that item. But generally, I would say do not recommend them for that reason. That they do give you that false sense of security, and you might be overexerting yourself more than maybe you would if you weren't using that. And there's been some research and white papers on that specific item, which you can definitely find if you do a little search. Carla's question, what are some modified duties that are recommended in a warehouse? That gets into the return to work realm. That gets more probably case by case specific, I would say. You agree, Josh?
Yeah, I was gonna say like and we've had Carla like honestly like because we talked about right now good examples like standard operating procedures like that was like some of the administrative stuff that's important that we have in our warehouse distribution, whether it's like labeling of your carts of how much quantity goes in containers, or like you're actually making the standard operating procedures for people as they're kind of going through the loading and unloading. So that's those are the some of the types of activities that I've used in the past for warehouse distribution. But I mean, to Nathan's point, it's kind of case by case, specific to the person. What can they not do? Kind of resources is in terms of like would they have access to being able to use a computer to help do some of those activities? Does that help meet kind of their accommodations? Um, so obviously, yeah, go back to your return to work program. Definitely trainers. We've used them for trainers in the past, depending on the person if they were a fit for that role. So it kind of comes back into that. The other thing too, and I did see this note because I know we're 1 minute towards just from wrapping up here. There was a question in around the changes in the frame of the workstation. Does it require engineering approval? Our answer back to that again, it's case by case basis. I'd go back to section table 7 of regulation 851 if it does apply, and at that point, that's where we would need to go through our pre-start and have that engineer sign off. Okay. I don't see any other questions, Nathan. I think everything else is just everyone else.
Yeah, perfect. I think there may be a couple kind of up above previously as we were talking. I'm not quite sure, but we can kind of sift through. And since we're
Yeah.
right at 12 now, we can sift through. And if there's any unanswered questions, we can definitely add that to the follow-up email. So yeah, so let's we'll just wrap it up there and say thank you everyone very much for attending and for helping us have a good conversation. Appreciate your questions, and hopefully we answered those. And there'll be a follow-up email which you can certainly get more information. These resources and more will be included in that. And yeah, feel free to reach out to us and connect with us through the website, WSPS.ca. You can find ways to contact us and through our customer care. If you want more information on any of this or any next steps as far as assessments, MSD prevention program development, that sort of thing. So really appreciate everyone's time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.